Thank you, Dr. Tracy. So before I start, two things. Please don't ask me about my Ph.D. Dissertation. That was 30 years ago, and I'm not sure that I could remember what it's about. And secondly, yes, I was interested in Seville's lectures, but I cheated. I had Tommy Sternkovich help me while I was on sabbatical. So I have a fair number of books on my shelves that belong to the category, I really should read that someday. I imagine some of you do too. There might even be a senior or two with a book in that category that was assigned reading for one of your core classes. You know who you are. My roommate in college acknowledged that everyone should read War and Peace before leaving this earth. So she was going to put it off as long as possible. I read it 40 years ago, and I've been living on borrowed time ever since. Until 10 years ago, when I was asked to teach Euclidean geometry, Euclid's Elements was in that category. An historical curiosity gathering dust on my shelf. Josef Pieper, in his book In Defense of Philosophy, makes the point that more often than not, some sort of push or challenge is required to, quote, trigger the philosophical process. He cites the examples of the death of a loved one or falling in love as potentially jolting a person to, as he puts it, unexpectedly see the world with profoundly different eyes. Other examples might include an illness, the birth of a child, graduating college. Pieper notes that these events can prompt us to ask a fundamental question. What's it all about? Less dramatic jolts in a narrower context can have a similar effect by making us rethink our opinions or perspective, or ask a question we'd never considered before. In Plato's dialogue Meno, or Meno for you classics folks, Socrates jolts Meno's slave boy with a torpedo shock, as he called it, inducing a state of perplexity or aporia, from which he leads the boy by questions through the process of doubling a square, illustrating the concept of knowledge by recollection. More on this later. Teaching Euclid for the first time gave me a torpedo shock. It's rather strange that one can get a Ph.D. in mathematics without ever having touched Euclid's Elements. I suppose it's not quite so bad as a philosophy professor never having read Plato or Aristotle, or a Catholic theologian never having read Aquinas. But the translator of the gold standard English version of Euclid comments, quote, "It is one of the noblest monuments of antiquity. No mathematician worthy of the name can afford not to know Euclid." Yikes. Well, there's an adage in education that if you really want to learn something, teach it. And here was my chance. So, I wondered, who was this Euclid? And what made his Elements such a noble monument? Up until then, my knowledge of Euclid came from little sidebars in textbooks or offhand references to him in literature. It turns out that very little is known about him, except that he flourished around 300 BC and wrote and taught at Alexandria in Egypt. He may have studied geometry at the Platonic school in Athens and possibly instructed Ptolemy I of Egypt in geometry. But that's just conjecture, perhaps fueled by legends taken as fact. Throughout the Middle Ages until the 16th century, he was conflated with Euclid of Megara, a philosopher and disciple of Socrates, although a secret one, for fear of the Athenians. There's a story in the Attic Nights that when the Megarans were banned under pain of death from entering Athens, he would sneak out at night, disguised as a woman, visit Socrates, bask in his wisdom, and then return home in the wee small hours to Megara. I must say, it's a relief to know that our Euclid, the father of geometry and founder of the axiomatic method in mathematics, was not skulking around in feminine garb in the pre-dawn twilight. And what of his elements? It was not a compendium of the geometrical knowledge of his time in the sense of an encyclopedia, but rather designed as a magnificent logical edifice, delicately balanced on a foundation of a couple dozen definitions and a paltry handful of assumptions or axioms, which were taken to be self-evident truths. The poet Goethe characterized architecture as erstarrte Musik, crystallized music. And I can't help but think of Euclid's arrangement of 465 propositions in 13 books in the same way. But my initial attitude toward teaching the elements was, I am ashamed to admit, along the lines of Euclidean geometry. That's high school stuff. On thumbing through the first volume, however, it immediately struck me this was not standard high school geometry. First of all, there were no numbers, no equations. The first indication that I wasn't in Kansas anymore. Where'd they go? Torpedo shocks don't just happen to individuals. They can happen between disciplines. And geometry had dealt a blow to the Pythagorean philosophy. For the Pythagoreans, everything was number, which meant that all quantities, arithmetical or geometrical, should bear a relation to one another expressible in terms of whole numbers. This meant, for example, that for any two lines, there should be a third line that serves as a common measure for both. Then one of the Pythagoreans discovered that the diagonal of a square and its side had no such common measure. The culprit, so the legend goes, was punished for his impiety by being drowned at sea, either by divine retribution or by his confreres. The result of the discovery was the separation of arithmetic and geometry, a rift that was to last into the 17th century. As I worked my way through the first book of the Elements, I became accustomed to his style and appreciated the logical progression of the propositions. Along the way, meeting some old familiar friends, like angle, side angle, congruence of triangles, and that opposite sides of a parallelogram are equal. But they weren't always immediately recognizable as such. Rather like seeing old classmates at your 20-year high school reunion. At first, they look so different. But after a while, they seem exactly as you remember them. But there were things that bothered me. Touted as the quintessential example of a demonstrative science as laid out in Aristotle's posterior analytics, Euclid didn't quite meet the mark. Rigorous proof is at the very heart of the practice of mathematics, and the Elements showed some cracks in the mortar and even in the foundation. There were extensions of some of the axioms that were not explicitly stated or proved. Some proofs relied on assumptions that are visually or intuitively obvious from a diagram, but not logically obvious. At least one proposition needed to be one of the axioms, part of the foundation, instead of the structure. And some kind of axiom of continuity was needed to guarantee the intersection of certain geometric objects. I was not, of course, the first to notice this. Early commentators of the elements, such as Pappus, Heron of Alexandria, and Proclus, noted and addressed some of these lacunae. For the most part, however, they had little quarrel with Euclid's logical structure. Then, in the early Middle Ages, Euclid all but disappeared in the West, but continued to flourish in the Byzantine world. And from there, the work was disseminated throughout the Arab world and Persia, copied, translated, and annotated by Muslim scholars. It returned to Western Europe largely through the Latin translation from Arabic by Abelard of Bath in the 12th century. Over the subsequent centuries, editions of Euclid in Latin, Greek, and the vernacular multiplied, some with minor modifications of the foundational axioms, but with a sequence of propositions left remarkably intact. It wasn't until near the turn of the 20th century, amid rising concerns over foundational questions in mathematics and logic, that Euclid's Elements was given an axiomatic overhaul by David Hilbert in his Grundlagen der Geometrie, Foundations of Geometry. He successfully patched and tuck-pointed Euclid's edifice in the sense that he provided a set of axioms from which the propositions of the elements could be rigorously deduced. A logician's geometrical paradise, but too abstruse to be useful to beginners. I might compare it to a performance of a full peal of English change ringing, gratifying to the ringers, fascinating to a mathematician, and an intolerable din for the poor pious visitor in the church pew. Why was this important? Because geometry was more than just a practical art to help settle land disputes between neighbors or build a house that won't fall down. It was a truth maker, something that produced knowledge from things better known to us, the axioms and definitions, to things better known in themselves, like the Pythagorean theorem. Safeguarding the logical rigor of the elements preserved the certainty of the truth of its propositions. Truth about what? Well, you know, lines and circles and squares and stuff like that. What exactly are geometric objects? Where do they come from? To return to the Meno dialogue, Socrates explains to Meno that the boy knew the solution of doubling the square all along. He just needed to be questioned, to bring it out, to recollect it. It all followed perfectly easily from basic properties of the square and simple arithmetic. Yet there's a question, not asked by either Socrates or Meno, or the boy for that matter. How did the boy know arithmetic and what a square is? And how did he recognize what Socrates drew as a square? By definition? When teaching my children to count, I assure you, I did not begin by saying, now, sweetheart, the natural numbers are the equivalence classes induced by the equivalence relation of equinumerosity on the class of finite sets. No. I modeled it for them, and they eventually figured it out. But I don't know exactly how. They also readily grasped the idea of a circle without my having to define it, even when I drew it. How? One way of approaching the question is from a Platonic philosophy of mathematics. There are, of course, various shades of mathematical Platonism, but the general idea is that circles and squares and other geometric objects are real, abstract, and independent of created intelligent agents like us, and for some versions, independent of the material world. They reside in the realm of ideal forms and are only approximated by their shadows in the physical world. Even our abstract thought of a particular circle can be considered a shadow. This approach is highly attractive for practicing mathematicians, especially pure mathematicians rather than applied. Why in the world would you dedicate your entire working life to discovering the truth about things that aren't even real, or just constructs of the human mind, or are dependent on the material world? Reuben Hirsch, a mathematician, claims, quote, "The typical working mathematician is a Platonist on weekdays and a formalist on Sundays." But a classical difficulty for Platonism in mathematics is the question of access. How can we know things about ideal circles in the realm of forms? Or how do we intuit geometric objects? A hardcore Platonist, like Socrates in the dialogue, might say, we already have knowledge of such things from our birth, or even from all eternity in our soul. The latter notion, of course, doesn't square with Catholic doctrine. Pardon the pun. Then when we encounter something in sense experience that is square-ish, we recognize or recollect it. The physical object acts as a trigger for recollection. Another approach is a more Aristotelian one, in which geometric objects are indeed real, but are abstracted from our sense experience. For example, we see a full moon and consider it qua circle, freed, so to speak, from the trammels of its physical matter. The intellect is then free to study it in its abstract, idealized aspect. I suspect this approach is attractive to physicists, since it nicely accounts for what physicist Eugene Wigmer termed the, quote, unreasonable effectiveness, end quote, of mathematics in modeling physical phenomena. In his 1960 essay, Wigner quotes Galileo. The laws of nature are written in the language of mathematics. And he further claims that that is truer now than ever before. One challenge for this view is to explain how idealized objects can be abstracted from things that don't actually have the same property. A circle is perfectly round. The moon is not. My apologies to the philosophy faculty if my characterization of these two opposing philosophies is somewhat ham-fisted. The discussion's been going on for over 2,000 years and will likely continue for 2,000 more, with much ink spilled on both sides, and I have no intention of entering the fray at the moment. But regardless of which side of the fence one chooses, both views raise a question, the answer to which has perhaps more to do with the nature of man than with the nature of mathematics. When we encounter a triangular object, such as a shard of shattered glass, why is it that the Platonist recalls, or the Aristotelian abstracts, a Euclidean triangle? Wait, what do you mean, Euclidean triangle? Triangle's a triangle, right? If we shift our focus away from the logical structure of the elements and toward the purpose of the whole project, we can better appreciate it as a work of genius, a noble monument. How Euclid arrived at the axioms for his foundation of geometry, we will never know this side of heaven. But I can imagine that he woke up one morning and said to himself, which axiom shall I play with today and see what I can prove? In the same manner as he might have said, shall I have my eggs soft-boiled or over easy this morning? Geometry had been studied long before Euclid, and there were certain accepted geometrical facts the truth of which was not doubted. Here are a few most students remember from high school geometry. 1, the angle sum of a triangle is 2 right angles, or 180 degrees if you insist. 2, the Pythagorean theorem. 3, any 3 points not on the same line determine a circle. And last, equiangular triangles have proportional sides. Euclid's challenge was to formulate, in addition to his other postulates and assumptions, an axiom that would guarantee the truth of these established facts, or perhaps observed facts. And the axioms should be self-evident like the others. Otherwise, geometry wouldn't be true. His brilliant answer was the famous 5th postulate, the so-called parallel postulate. The version that most people are familiar with is Playfair's axiom. Through a point, not on a given line, there is at most one line parallel to the given line. Sir Henry Saville, in his inaugural lectures on Euclid, after establishing the Oxford Chair of Geometry in 1619, commented that the elements had 2 moles, 2 blemishes. One blot on the otherwise immaculate work was this very postulate, Euclid's theory of parallels. It had been a burr under the saddle for mathematicians for over 1,000 years, not because anyone doubted it, but because it was felt that it should be proved rather than assumed as an axiom. But it had defeated all comers. As a side note, regardless of one's feelings about the 5th postulate, Euclid's use of it was masterful. I suggest that his triumphal march in Book 1, from its first use in the 29th proposition to the 32nd, where he proves the angle sum of a triangle is 2 right angles, to the 47th, the Pythagorean theorem, rivals Verdi's triumphal march in his opera Aida. And then, around 1830, geometry delivered another torpedo shock to philosophy, even to geometry. 3 mathematicians independently essentially showed that the 5th postulate couldn't be deduced from the other axioms. One was Gauss, arguably the greatest mathematician ever, and the other 2 were Janusz Bolyai and Nikolai Lobachevsky. Their method was to replace the 5th postulate with an alternative contradictory one, from which they developed a whole new geometry, now termed hyperbolic geometry. Its impact was not immediately felt. By dint of caution on the part of Gauss, and by dint of obscurity on the part of the other 2. After the dust settled, 2 things became apparent. 1, the 3-dimensional extension of Euclidean plane geometry with its 5th postulate did not necessarily model the space of the universe. And second, the axioms of Euclidean geometry were no longer self-evident. Oddly enough, this vindicated Euclid's inclusion of his parallel postulate. In the presence of the other axioms, it is what makes Euclid Euclidean. 1 mole removed. The loss of the self-evident nature of Euclid's parallel postulate leads us back to the question: why do we perceive a Euclidean triangle when we see something triangular? The nature of a triangle depends on which postulate is chosen, the Euclidean parallel postulate or the hyperbolic postulate, all other things being equal. Book 6 of the Elements, among other things, deals with similar triangles, and the related proposition rests solidly on the Euclidean postulate. In Book 4, there's a construction of equiangular but not congruent triangles, which also requires the Euclidean postulate. The fourth proposition in Book 6 shows that equiangular triangles have proportional sides. That is, they are similar. And it is here, perhaps, that mathematics can provide a clue as to why the geometry that Euclid's parallel postulate was adopted to support was in fact Euclidean as opposed to hyperbolic. In all the failed attempts to prove the parallel postulate from the other axioms, something is tacitly assumed that is actually equivalent to it, and so begs the question. There are a dozen or so statements that are logically equivalent to the fifth postulate. That is, statements that not only can be proved by it, but conversely can themselves prove it. If any statement equivalent to the parallel postulate were substituted for it in Euclid's axiomatic system, all the statements in the elements would still hold. It would be the same geometry. For some of them, equivalence to the parallel postulate is fairly straightforward to prove. For others, much less so. One of these latter is that there exist just two similar but not congruent triangles. This is essentially Euclid's proposition 4 from Book 6. A version of this axiom was championed as a substitute for the parallel postulate by no other than John Wallis, who, ironically, later in the 1600s, held the Oxford Chair of Geometry. The proof that this axiom implies the parallel postulate is difficult, and I doubt if Euclid was aware of one. His goal was the other way around, which brings us to the intervening book, his infamous Book 5, which treats Eudoxus's non-arithmetical theory of ratio and proportion. Henry Saville's blot number 2, the second mole on the elements. The necessity of dealing with ratios and proportions in a purely geometrical way, rather than arithmetical, stems from the torpedo shock mentioned earlier, that some geometric quantities are incommensurable. They have no common measure. I freely admit that the first time I worked through Book 5, I was a stranger in a strange land. It is no surprise that mathematicians and scholars through the ages, not just Saville, criticized Euclid's definition of proportion, or sought in vain to sidestep it, as most of my students wish we would do. Augustus de Morgan, a 19th century logician, asked, quote, "What right had Euclid, or anyone else, to expect that this most prolix and unwieldy statement should be received by the beginner as the definition of a relation, the perception of which is one of the most common acts of his mind, since it is performed on every occasion where similarity or dissimilarity of figure is looked for or presents itself?" In Heath's edition of the Elements, he gives the Greek text of the definitions along with his English translation. I didn't know any Greek the first time through, and I must say that when it came to Euclid's definition of proportion, I understood the English text no better than the Greek. After learning a little Greek, sorry, Dr. Beer, I don't think I remember much of it, I noticed that the word Euclid, the word that Euclid uses for ratio is logos. Odd. I was used to hearing the word in connection with the beginning of St. John's Gospel. Proportional was analogon, meaning according to the ratio. Analogia is the noun version, proportion. A Greek lexicon provides more meanings of logos than you can shake a stick at. Word, reason, speech, discourse, command, reckoning, generative principle, relation, etc., etc., etc. And yes, mathematical ratio. If you dig a bit into its etymology, you find a word root that means to collect or gather together words, in the sense of choosing them carefully to get just the right ones. And this fits with the idea of speech, a collection of words that fit together in a particular way, each in proper relation to the others. Euclid's definition of ratio itself is a vague statement about being a sort of relation with respect to size between two magnitudes of the same kind, such as length to length or area to area. But it's his definition of proportional, analogon, that makes precise what it means for two ratios to be the same. As De Morgan noted, perceiving that sameness of ratio is one of the most common acts of the mind. It is this common act of the mind that could be the reason why we recollect or abstract a Euclidean rather than a hyperbolic triangle. This universal, seemingly innate, essentially human sense of proportion or scale. Even very small children, just learning to talk, when they see a 5x7 family photo, will point to Dad in the picture and say, "Dada," when Dad is actually 6 feet tall, not 6 inches. When toddlers draw, they instinctively attempt to keep it to scale. Prehistoric cave paintings show images drawn, more or less, to scale. The principle carries over to non-mathematical terms as well. Plato's dividing line in the Republic uses proportional lines to show the relative importance of sense cognition and intellection. Even in the Our Father, we say, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." According to Aquinas, we can use the same word to denote an attribute of man and an attribute of God, but only analogically, literally, proportionately. Euclidean geometry seems to be built into our nature. So, if Logos and Analogia made Euclid Euclidean, man is indeed a rational animal. Thank you.